Okay, so we'll just roll right to our speaker here. Our speaker today is Dr. DeAnn Presley. So DeAnn wears many hats actually within the Department of Agronomy. She does lots of extension work, she does lots of teaching, and lots of research to go with it. And so we asked her today to do some discussion on cover crops and how they can affect your nutrient management program, specifically nitrogen, but I think she's going to cover a lot of other areas here. So with that, DeAnn, I think we are ready to kick off with you if you are ready to roll, and I'll stop sharing so you can get your slides up here.
Sounds good. Let me get those going.
Okay.
Make sure I click the right thing here. Share screen. There we go.
We really did practice this, guys, ahead of time. So
we did. I just got all excited. So thanks for having me. So as Jeannie said, I do a lot of different things. And usually when I talk about cover crops, I'm more talking about soil improvement and building soil organic matter and sustainability and erosion and things like that. But the agents asked me to kind of tune it in and focus in on crop nutrients, because as we know, there's a lot of instability with nutrient prices right now. And so how can cover crops, how can that help us? And so I want to give some credit to Peter Tomlinson. He and I worked together on this slide set. So let's start off with a poll question. I want to know who's here today. So how many years have you planted cover crops? A, B, C, D, so we got 0, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, or 11 or more years. And I just randomly chose those categories, but I just was curious if we had some cover croppers in the room. And it looks like, yeah, it looks like some of everything. So that doesn't have anything to do with nutrients, and you could have planted cover crops for a variety of reasons. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, I plant cover crops for my livestock to graze on, does that count? Yes, we'll count that. So technically that's probably a forage, but you get a lot of environmental benefits out of it too. When you graze them, it's great for soils. So we'll take it. All right. I'll just keep talking for just a second in case anybody in case anybody's like, I want to get my answer in. I like to get my answer in. So, and this is a volunteer turnip in one of my research plots one time that I thought was kind of cute. So it got kind of large, but all right. Okay, sounds good. We'll click on to the next slide here. Let's see. Jeannie, what do I do to stop the polling? I lock it. I hit the little lock thing.
If you just hit your arrow, does it not take it forward?
There we go. Yep.
There we go. Okay.
Yep, the arrow helps. Okay, so why cover crops? So cover crops have been used to enhance the sustainability of cropping systems. And honestly, cover crops are something people have done for forever. So you can go back and read in history books about cover crops that people have used in different cultures over the years. So before industrial fertilizer production began, people had to do this practice, right? So growing legumes. So legumes, of course, are the kind of plant that fix their own nitrogen through a symbiotic association with a bacteria. Legumes use systems to fix nitrogen for a next crop. Nowadays, people are interested in them for a lot of reasons, such as improving soil quality and soil health. That definitely works. Reducing soil erosion. That definitely works, meaning that is a very beneficial reason to use a cover crop. So as far as affecting nutrients, though, cover crops can help with nutrient leaching. So this morning I was texting with somebody that farms on an extremely sandy soil. And I, at my own house, have an extremely clayey soil. So we were joking about, wouldn't it be nice if we could just swap some and have a mixture? Because that'd make for better soils for both of us. So in his soils, where he's got just extremely sandy soils, cover crops can actually help with growing in the off season. So between two cash crops, having roots there that are growing and living are a good way to keep nitrogen, for example, from leaching down through the soil profile. So if you farm on some sandy soil, some good crops, cover crops that can help with that would be radishes, turnips, anything with a deep rooting system to go down and scavenge nitrogen and bring it back up to the surface where it can be useful later on. Nutrient runoff. So we have a large study near Manhattan where we're studying the effects of cover crops and how they can mitigate sediment running off the field, and also the nutrients that travel with the sediment. So usually we think of phosphorus traveling with sediment across the field. So in both of those cases, leaching or surface runoff, cover crops can definitely help with retaining nutrients in the field where we want them, where they can be useful, rather than going somewhere else and being an environmental problem. So the things I'm going to talk about a little bit. So grow it, cover crop, legumes fixing atmospheric nitrogen. Bring it on sandy soils, having cover crops that can scavenge nitrogen up and keep it from leaching out of the soil profile. Keeping it, cover crops slowing runoff so it deters sediment-bound nutrients from leaving the field quite so easily. And then this is one that people are really interested in and the jury is still out on, which is, will a healthier soil ecosystem, if you have more microbes in the soil and more diverse microbes, will that lead to more rapid nutrient cycling? It seems intuitive that yes, it should, but there's still work happening on that particular topic. So I can't really answer that, other than to say that we do observe, there have been observations of different rates of residue decomposition in soils with different crop rotations or different practices, but that is still an area of a lot of active study still happening today. So I'm going to talk about a study that has it's a wheat, sorghum, soybean experiment. This is happening near Manhattan. So it's wheat, and then a cover crop is grown, and then sorghum, and then soybean. So obviously we could talk about winter cover crop. So in the case of this wheat sorghum rotation, we can do one of two things. We can plant either a summer cover crop here, or we could plant a cover crop to grow in the winter. Either way, we're going to see how that benefits the sorghum crop. And then we grow soybeans after that. So there's no cover crop here. Okay, so one of our possibilities is chemical fallow, do nothing, right? So we'll spray it to kill the weeds, hence the chemical, but fallow meaning plant nothing in the meantime. We could also just have a regular double crop soybean crop, right? We don't have to have cover crop. We could, in this period of time, we can grow a double crop soybean. And then summer non-legume in this experiment is a sorghum Sudan for forage. In this case, so I should say that the sorghum Sudan was not removed from the field. It was just left on the field, whereas typically anybody else would bale it off or potentially graze it. In this case, we left it on the field because we wanted to see what the effect would be on the sorghum crop. And then a summer legume, so in this case, a forage soybean. So it was a late maturity group, so that we didn't really want it to see it setting pods. We just wanted it to stay vegetative and grow. And so while the above ground part is growing, the below ground part is fixing nitrogen and putting on a whole bunch of nodules, fixing nitrogen and growing nitrogen for the sorghum crop. Or a winter non-legume would be a radish, and a radish would be a good one for going down. These are daikon style radishes, so a large white root that then goes, actually, people are always interested in how big the root is, you know, that 18-inch long giant diameter radish that people grow. But what is really exciting to me is the part of the root that you can't really get out of the ground very well because it always breaks off. But Craig Rosenboom has noted that there's been water extraction by those radishes down 5, 6, 7, 8 feet in the ground. So that's how far that tip of that, the skinny part of that taproot is going to scrounge nutrients and bring them back up to the surface. And then we also have a winter legume in this experiment. So crimson clover, which is gorgeous. And right now it's about 6, 8, maybe 10 inches to a foot tall. So some years we do better with other than crimson clover. It's not super winter hardy, but that's the experiment. So this is a lot of data. So let's just focus up here first. So 2013, here's some information on the summer legume versus summer non-legume. So the kinds of dry matter we got. So 0.6 tons per acre for the summer legume versus this is sorghum Sudan grass for the 2.6 tons per acre. And you can see the nitrogen content and the CDN ratio. So let's go down here to 2014. Same thing, summer legume. And you'll notice that there's 4 cover crop treatments. That's because the chem fallow, we didn't have any biomass. And the double crop soybeans, no biomass. We didn't cut those, right? Those are just growing. So summer legume in this case, again, is the forage soybean. Summer non-legume is the sorghum Sudan grass. Winter legume is the crimson clover, and winter non-legume is the radish. These are the above ground dry matters. We didn't collect below ground. And these are the nitrogen content. So this is how much nitrogen they are growing. And then the C to N ratio is, so when you clip that cover crop biomass, when you clip that, and then we can grind that up and take it to the soil testing lab. So we clip it, we dry it, grind it up, take it to the soil testing lab, and how many parts carbon for every 1 part nitrogen. Well, the wider this ratio is, the bigger that front number is, means that it's going to decompose slowly, and it'll provide a lot of ground cover or residue for the next growing crop. Versus when these numbers are lower, usually lower than 30, means that they're going to decompose pretty fast for the next crop. So these are the total pounds of nitrogen grown by these crops. And then in 2015, you can see that overall the tonnages were higher. So 3.4 tons for the forage soybean, 6 tons per acre for the sorghum Sudan grass. So the more tons we grow, the more pounds of nitrogen we grow. So here we had 6 tons for the summer non-legume versus 2.7 tons the year before. And that's one thing I'll point out, is that every year that we do an experiment, we see something slightly different. The amount of growth we get is always different. It's always affected by the weather. I drive past one of my cover crop experiments every single day because it's like the next field over from my house. And this year it is so dry, and my cover crops are not looking very spectacular because it's a dry year. So I'm a little worried about what my total biomass is going to be, the total tons of above ground biomass. So the more tons we grow, the more nitrogen we have. But how much is available to the next crop? Always the $1 million question. So that was the goal of the project, is to determine how legacy effects of legume and non-legume summer and winter cover crops between that wheat sorghum window affect the nitrogen available to the cropping system. And we can look at that in terms of the yield response of the sorghum to nitrogen fertilization. So sorghum, for the sorghum, these are the nitrogen treatments. So 0, 40, 108, 0, 40, 80, 120, and 160 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 28% UAN subsurface banded with a straight flat Coulter liquid fertilizer applicator. And this is applied following sorghum planting. So we are also measuring the effects on soil properties. And so this is one of the interesting things I'd like to point out, is that this is a soil total carbon in grams per kilogram. In percent, that would just be, you'd put a decimal point between here. So our soil here, this is about 2% so total carbon, which is about 3.4% organic matter. That's in the 0 to 5 depth. So centimeter depth, which is 0 to 2 inches depth. And then down at the, so it's about 3.4 here versus 1. This is 1.4, so 1.4 times 1.7, so not 3% here. But what I want to show is that there's no significant difference. So this is obviously with depth. The only place we're seeing a change in our soil carbon right now, so if you're thinking about carbon storage programs or carbon trading programs, where we're starting to see a real differentiation is up here at the top. So here the chem fallow, as I would expect, had the lowest amount of soil organic carbon or soil carbon because we're not growing anything. In fact, we're preventing things from growing over the summer by spraying them out. So the only carbon additions to that would be when the crop is growing. And then basically everything else kind of is jumbled together, but the one that's starting to be the highest is, and there's some significant differences here. The one that has the largest amount of organic carbon is the one growing the most biomass, which is also intuitive. That's the sorghum Sudan grass. It's starting to differentiate itself as storing more carbon. And that would be different if that number might be different if we were baling that off or if we were grazing it. Grazing usually returns most things to the system. So if you're baling off that sorghum Sudan grass and taking it away, I'm not sure what this result would be. But we are also looking at a nitrogen response. So this, you can see, it kind of looks like a patchwork quilt of greenness out here in the sorghum, where you can see there's some lighter spots with nitrogen deficiency and other spots where it looks fine. So this is what we do with this kind of data. So let's take an 8-year average, 2009 to 2016, sorghum response to cover crops. And by the way, this is a large experiment where there's sorghum grown every year. There's wheat grown every year. There's soybeans grown everywhere. And we call that as having every phase of the rotation present. So this is really 8 years worth of sorghum. And so you can see, this is how we decide, okay, so we grew a bunch of nitrogen. We grew a bunch of biomass that contains a bunch of nitrogen, but how much is available to the next crop? We can do this sort of math with it. So here we can see the line that sort of sticks out like a sore thumb is the summer non-legume. So if we grow a whole bunch of material, dry matter, that's relative, that means when microbes go to turn around and start breaking it down, they're using a lot of nitrogen, and that's not available to the next crop. So that's why this line is depressed, right? But these other lines are showing, and that's overcome at this highest level. So at 160 pounds of nitrogen, then there was no immobilization by the microbes. So what we can focus in on here is this box. And so saying, okay, at 80 pounds of nitrogen. So if we were trying to grow cover crops to save on our fertilizer bill, or as a choice of, maybe it's not about the fertilizer bill, but it's a choice for sustainability and saying, instead of buying so much nitrogen, I'm going to grow my own nitrogen. So that's what I would say is everything's just a choice. I have no opinions on what somebody should do. It's just what you want to do. And so here is this where it really becomes useful. So if you apply too much nitrogen, you're not going to get a savings. But if you're in this 80-pound range, you can start to see where the summer legume is showing that it's got the greatest yield with, and that's because we had a lot of nitrogen supplied by that crop. So here's a 2012 actually, I'm going to skip that one. Well, I'll just say this is a fairly typical year. And so double crop soybeans had a grain yield. This is a sorghum after the double crop soybeans were very good. After the summer legume, it was similar. It's a summer legume cover crop is going to have about a similar nitrogen contribution as if you had double crop soybeans in this case. Then the summer non-legume, this is the sorghum Sudan grass. It grew a lot of nitrogen, but it also required some nitrogen to decompose that amount of biomass. The winter non-legume is here in the BC group. And then the one that's down here by itself, although it's similar to chem fallow and similar to winter non-legume, we would have hoped that this winter legume would have been up here a little ways, right? We would hope that winter legume would produce a lot of nitrogen that's then available to the next crop in the rotation. But that didn't really happen. And that's because as gorgeous as crimson clover is, I just don't think it's producing enough nitrogen to really do. If nitrogen fixation is your goal, it's not quite doing what we want in this rotation. So here, and you might laugh at this fertilizer value, but I wanted to leave this slide in and show you that the first time we ever made this figure, this is what the nitrogen price was. So I didn't check it today to see what we're at, but if 90 cents is fairly reasonable, there you go. So it doesn't change our statistics, it just changes our number as far as value goes. So chemical value, this is a mean grain yield at 0 pounds of nitrogen applied. So if we applied no nitrogen, what would we get? So at no nitrogen, chem fallow yielded 88 bushels, double crop soybeans. Well, I'll start with the high one. The summer legume was our best value then. If we're going to apply no nitrogen, meaning that's basically like as if we were in an organic system, then the summer legume did a very good job at fixing nitrogen. And then everything with a B behind it would group together. So chem fallow, double crop soybean, winter legume, winter non-legume, they're all about the same. The summer non-legume, so that's the sorghum Sudan grass, would not be, the one for growing nitrogen. It's consuming nitrogen. So it grouped differently. So the fertilizer nitrogen equivalent credit would be none for chem fallow about 8 pounds of nitrogen per acre for double crop soybean, 30 pounds per acre for summer legumes or forage soybean. Summer non-legume, of course, would be a consumer of nitrogen. The winter legume, this is not what we expected or wanted, but this is what we got. It's just not fixing enough. And winter non-legume or radish, again, it's not going to fix nitrogen. We'd hoped it would scavenge, but it's not going to overcome the nitrogen needed. So these are the values. So our best value would be the summer legume or double crop soybean would be a positive number as well. But yeah, so that's our best value then in this particular system is a summer legume. And this information here talks about how you substitute that in to solve for that. So now I want to ask another poll question. So what are your main reasons for planting cover crops? I know obviously if you joined here for this particular topic, maybe you were wanting to learn about nitrogen, but I know that there's a lot of reasons. And so there are so many reasons to grow a cover crop. As I can see coming in now, we see a distribution and more than one of these reasons. And I think that's reasonable too. So fixing nitrogen can be done with the legumes to be more sustainable, such as less soil erosion, store carbon in soil. Grazing, definitely something that we, the number 2 state in beef cattle currently, we, in fact, in my neighborhood where I live in Northeast Kansas, there are a lot of cover crops that are grazed. And if they're not grazed, a lot of my neighbors are actually doing this for weed control reasons. So as a way of hoping that they can maybe have one less herbicide pass or one less expensive herbicide or less expensive choices in herbicides. So weed control is a very popular reason right now too. And so I'm not surprised at all to see more than one of these reasons being chosen by a lot of people too. So although it's funny that nobody chose to fix nitrogen for this particular talk, and that's fine because it is not one of the more typical reasons that people. Now, if you're an organic producer, of course you're going to grow cover crops to fix nitrogen. It's one of the main tools in their toolbox as far as fertilizer goes. That manure, obviously, too, but it's a very common practice. So thanks for answering that. So cover crop selection and nitrogen management impacts sorghum productivity, and there's a potential to replace a portion of cash crop nitrogen requirement with the summer legume cover crops. And 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre is what we can get from those late maturing soybeans. There are other choices too. So you might be thinking, well, what about cowpeas? Cowpeas, mung beans, forage soybeans, they're all excellent choices. Your choice should be personal. I always think about picking a cover crop like going car shopping. It's a pretty personal choice for what kind of car you're going to go buy. Am I going to buy a car or do I need to haul stuff? So maybe I'm going to buy a pickup, it's going to be a very personal choice for what you need it to be for your farm. But a high carbon and nitrogen ratio cover crop such as sorghum sudan grass, if you leave it there in the field, is going to require additional nitrogen input. So although we had no significant improvement on nitrogen supply with winter cover crops, there could be other potential benefits, such as reducing potential nitrogen losses. That's a very relevant choice, a very good choice for people for using cover crops. And then nitrogen rates for optimizing sorghum yields depends on your choice of cover crops, but the nitrogen rate for that summer non-legume, so where we had a sorghum sudan grass, you'd have to apply about 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre. But those other cover crops and double crop soybeans, 80 pounds of nitrogen was optimum in those particular systems. So you can save on it doesn't have to just be forage sorghum. So whether that was the cover crops and soybean, forage soybean, or the double crop soybean, about 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre was required for growing our sorghum crop at our location. So now I'm going to go back to something a little bit older, and this was a really good study that was before its time almost. So effects of late maturing soybean and sun hemp, summer cover crops, and nitrogen rate in a no-till wheat grain sorghum rotation. So this one was done at Heston. So it was from the mid 90s to 2009. There was much research done by a man named Dr. Mark Clausen at the Heston experiment field. So it's also wheat grain sorghum with cover crops in between. For 8 years, he did use hairy vetch, but then he changed because of cost, availability of seed, interference with control of volunteer wheat and winter annual weeds, and possibility of hairy vetch becoming a weed in wheat after sorghum. It was an excellent fixer of nitrogen, but there was a variety of reasons, as you can see. So it was consistently producing about 100 pounds of nitrogen, though. So if that's your goal, it's a good one, but you have to be aware of its other potential issues. So there was wheat, no cover sorghum, wheat, late soybeans as a cover sorghum, or wheat, sun hemp as a cover sorghum. Those were your rotations. So sun hemp is Crotalaria gensea. It is not in the cannabis family, but it has, leaves that come apart from a center point, kind of like that look, but they have a smooth leaf margins, and they're a legume. Dig them up, you'll find big nodules underneath. They're a legume. So soybean produced 3.68 tons per acre of dry matter with a nitrogen content of 2.64, or a total of 195 pounds per acre, versus sun hemp produced about 4.13 tons per acre with a nitrogen content of 1.78, or 146 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And both provided a between 91 and 100% weed control. So rather good weed control with the legume. There was also a nitrogen rate component of the study with 0, 30, 60, and 90 pounds of nitrogen applied to the grain sorghum. So late maturity soybean increased grain sorghum yields at N rates of 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 60 pounds per acre or less, but generally had no yield benefit versus cover crop when the nitrogen rates increased to 90 pounds an acre. So similar to that last study I talked about, if you're going to just over apply nitrogen, you're never going to really see these benefits of a legume cover crop. So sun hemp tended to increase yields of sorghum at all N rates, although to a lesser extent at the highest N rate. When averaged over N rate, the Harvey County experiment field long-term grain sorghum yield benefits from late maturing soybean and sun hemp amounted to 8.8 and 14.9 bushels per acre respectively. So that is to say they were beneficial from a yield perspective. So now if you're thinking about economics, you're like, but do they pay for themselves? And that is always the question, right? That is always a super excellent question. It's going to depend on what the price of nitrogen is, the price of the herbicide to terminate them is. It's going to depend on how you're going to plant them, and if you're going to fly on, you wouldn't fly either one of these on probably, but if you did fly them on versus directly seeding them. So there's a lot of side that. So in some years, the seed was expensive and nitrogen was cheap, so it'd be cheaper to apply nitrogen directly. But if nitrogen prices are high and seed prices aren't that high, so grain, forage soybean might not be that expensive, it might pay for itself more easily in some years. Okay, so these are the details. So I'm not going to go into all these details other than to say that these reports are available online. And so if you want to know all the nitty gritty about that kind of stuff, you could get into that here. So this is effects of soybean and sun hemp cover crops and nitrogen rate on no-till grain sorghum after wheat. So it has all of the details with the nitrogen rates to each of the crops. This is the nitrogen rate for the soybean, for the sorghum. So how many tons per acre were produced? So 3 to 4 tons per acre. Yields, grain sorghum, stand, did we get the same stand? So all those details. And then this is also on the wheat. So it went wheat, cover crop, sorghum, and then back to wheat. And so were there any long-term effects on wheat, on the wheat of the system? So does it pay? Does the nitrogen content of the cover crop save you from applying some nitrogen? And does that outweigh the cost of the cover crop seed? And that depends on the cost of the seed, the price of nitrogen, and what's available, and cost share programs. So if you're enrolling with NRCS or potentially some other entity, watershed program to plant cover crops if they're helping to with some of those costs for a few years. Also, other programs such as carbon markets, which reward planting cover crops. If you're wanting to sign up with one of the 10 or more different companies offering money for, signing up for sequestering carbon, many of those programs talk about no-till and cover crops and that's another whole topic. But yes, we can store more carbon with cover crops. And another thing is landlords. There are an increasing number of people in their landlord-tenant relationships that are saying, hey, I'd like my tenants to use cover crops. And so maybe it's just a part of what you need to do. And then deciding, okay, well, what's the right cover crop for my rotation and for my objective? That is a long conversation that needs to be well thought out. So, and for some of you that are on here, maybe this is not going to be a number that you think you have. If it depends. Do you think, how many pounds of nitrogen do you think you have fixed with cover crops on your farm? And if you're not really sure, you can definitely pick item F there. That's why I put it there. But if you're not planting a legume, if you've never planted a legume, well, then you're not really fixing any. So this would have to be for those that are growing legumes, truly fixing. So fixation happening from nodules and bacteria, fixing it.
So DeAnn, what is this in the photo that we're seeing?
That is crimson clover. It's so pretty, isn't it? Like, I don't think it's possible to even have a cover crop talk without having a crimson clover picture. So this was seeded around, I have a water hydrant that we installed. And so I planted some crimson clover around it to be pretty. And then I took pictures. So it's gorgeous. We have a bunch of it growing near Manhattan, and I just wish we got a little more nitrogen out of it. But it is excellent ground cover. I mean, so if you're not really concerned about nitrogen production, but you want to have ground cover to stop erosion in its tracks and keep sediment in place and have better water infiltration, it's a good one for that. So they all have their pluses and minuses. So across the board there.
DeAnn, I recognize it from my parents' farm in far northeast Kansas, on creek bottom or creek ground. So I recognize it. So I was excited to see it as part of your discussion here.
Yeah, and that one, that could be either crimson clover or that could be red clover. So red clover can grow wild too. And then there's a lot of different prairie clovers, purple prairie clover and things like that. So a lot of clovers are native. So the last thing I'll end with, so that we can go to questions, is talking about the Midwest Cover Crop Selector tool. So if you're in that boat of like, well, I don't know what cover crop I want to grow, or I'm thinking about some other ones, or somebody, if you're an agronomist and somebody asks you about one, you're like, I have no idea. I want to go look it up. This is a great site. So I just, you can either get that website or I just Google Midwest Cover Crops Council. So that's people like me, that's people like extension agents, that's people like seed industry people, nonprofits, government groups. We all get together and say, what do we know about cover crops that we can provide to other people and be useful? And it's hosted at Michigan State. That's why it's an msu.edu website. And so it's got a lot of info. There's upcoming events, there's documents you can order. But the reason I'm going here right now is talk about the decision tool. So the decision tool is where you start with, where's your farm? So Kansas, and I chose Ellsworth County, and then you can tell us about your goals. So there's a drop down there where there's like erosion control or forage for livestock, or, like probably 8 different choices. I just chose nitrogen source for today. And then you would put in your crop rotation. So if I was here on my farm in Potawatomi County, I would say corn, soybean. And it would ask me, well, when are you going to plant and harvest? And so what that does then is it gives you a long choice list. Every question you answer, it'll shorten up your choices. So we've got different crops rated. So these are our top nitrogen fixers for Kansas. And I want to explain these ranges because they're obviously huge, right? So all of these are getting a rating of 4, which means they're good choices. Cowpeas could fix anywhere from 10 to 80 pounds of nitrogen. And that's available for the next crop. But They'll fix 80 if they grow just perfectly and you had a huge long season and the plants above ground get massive and there's massive fixation below ground. But a lot of times we never see 80. It's more like, I don't know, like anything, right? Like, what's my best bowling score I ever got? Well, I probably got above 200 one time, but usually I bowl more like 100. So it's kind of like this with cowpeas or any of these. It's probably what's realistic is the middle of the range or less, because a lot of times with cover crops, we don't give them long enough to grow. I don't know how many times with cover crops I've gone to plant them and then it rained or something was broken or I couldn't get there and get it done in time. So the shorter you make your season for growing it, the more of the left side of each of these ranges you're going to be on. So sun hat 20 to 120 is possible, but probably more like 60 or less. Sweet clover, it can be a big range. Hairy vetch in Heston, we were growing it huge, and we were getting, up to 100 pounds of nitrogen consistently. So we can do it if we give it a proper window of time to grow in, get it planted on time, terminate it, as late as we possibly can before the next crop. And of course, that was sorghum getting planted after that. So we plant sorghum a little later. If we were trying to plant corn, we probably never would have got to 100, if that makes sense. Okay, so this is for nitrogen. These are all getting a rating of 3, which means that they grow okay, but not as good as those ones on the other slide. So mung beans, red clover, Springfield pea, winter pea, soybeans, we know how to grow those. Those are probably a 4. Chickling vetch, common vetch, again, they're all getting a 3s. Like, they're pretty good, but they're not as stellar as the first page. Now 2, crimson clover, 50 to 70. That 70 is high. I've never seen 70. That's just what we say in our Midwest cover crops guidance, but truly, I've never seen it get there. Guar, that's more of a southern thing that they grow for a crop, but we didn't give guar a higher rating because we just didn't feel like we knew enough about guar. And lentils, those have not been growing that well in Kansas. We can grow them okay, but they're not awesome. So that's why we gave them a 2. So we rank everything. We put our collective brains together and say, what do we know about these that we can give some guidance on? And I'll say it's still an active subject of conversation. So this is an experiment where we have cover crops that we've clipped and they were growing here. And then we clipped them and stuffed some in these bags, and we're measuring how they decompose over time. And then there's sensors. So we know the soil temperature and soil moisture. We can say, okay, well, now that we know this, what are we going to get? So with that, that's kind of how that works. And so to give time for questions, I'm just going to skip to this and then I'll open it up for questions. So what do you like for cover crops that you've used? So you could probably type in, and I think you can only answer once. So maybe if you're going to write a bunch of things, you should type them all into the same box and then send them in the same response. I made this one a word cloud. Oh, by the way, this is hairy vetch here. So it is so pretty. It can be a little problematic, but it's so pretty. Yellow sweet clover, love it. And this can be anything. This doesn't have to be a legume. This could be any kind of cover crop. I guess I could say what one of mine is. One of mine is cereal rye, because you can just plant it so late and get away with it.
Hey, DeAnn, and that did come in the chat box. Somebody said cereal rye.
Yeah. It's durable. Of course, it's not a nitrogen fixer, but it's, as far as my favorite all-purpose plant it, abuse it cover crop, there's 2 really. It's cereal rye and triticale. So they always grow well, and you can forget to plant about them for my birthday is December 3rd, and I always joke, it feels like every year we plant some cover crop, some cereal rye on my birthday, and we get away with it. Now, is that the right thing to do? No, we should plant it at the proper time. I just mean that it's one that if you're going to plant on the edge of extreme lateness, you can get away with it more easy with that than anything else. All right, so I'll take questions.
Okay, we had several questions that came in, so
All right.
we'll try to get to all of them. If we don't, we can definitely get that information to you afterwards, or DeAnn, you can even answer some of those. So
Yeah, I'm happy to stick around. I don't have anywhere to be now, so
okay,
we can
okay.
go as long as you want to.
All righty. Well, again, my name is Sandra Wick, and I'm the Post Rock District Crop Protection Agent. First question that came in is, DeAnn, do you have any recommended cover crops for McPherson County? And maybe that would be a good one for them to use that tool that you just explained.
Yeah, so I would want to know a little bit more about like goals, like first thing I always ask is, okay, let's talk about crop rotations. If it's McPherson County, I could probably guess there's going to be some wheat in that rotation, although it doesn't have to be, because I'd probably need to back up one step and say, is it irrigated? And then after that, I'd say, okay, well, what kind of crop rotation? And so if it's crop rotation, so if it's between corn and soybeans, then I would give you one answer. If it's between soybeans and corn, I'd give you another answer. If it's between wheat and something, I'd give you another answer. So I would say you have a lot of choices for McPherson County, though. It's right smack in the middle. Any of the ones, if wheat's in the rotation and you're not growing a double crop soybean, then the world is your oyster. You have a lot of choices. We've got on that list, that Midwest Cover Crop Council list, we have, I think, 44 different choices for Kansas. So I would say there's a lot of choices there.
Okay, well, and I would just say another question might be kind of along that same line is, there is really no magic number. I mean, to have up to 10 or have 3 to 5, because sometimes the cost can be a little prohibitive the more you add.
Right, yeah. So I didn't even talk about mixes. Mixes are great from the perspective of if you plant a mixture of things, like 3 things in a mix, one year you might see just a bunch of one thing, and then the next year time you do it, you might see more of the other thing. And that's the same thing I see in pastures too. I look out in pastures, and some years it'll just be like, whoa, where did that come from? It was the perfect year for this to just be plentiful. But then the next year you might see, whoa, more of this. So yeah, in mixtures, people can put as many things as they want in a mix, and they should put whatever they want, but you're exactly right about cost. It's like, it's like going shopping for a car or a house or something. What's your max you want to pay? And then design it from there. So $30 or $40 an acre is probably the max I'd be willing to pay. But if you're wanting to fix nitrogen and you're going to plant straight legumes are the most expensive seed we can choose. So your budget will probably need to be higher for growing some nitrogen.
Okay, and Jeannie had put in the chat box the direct link to that tool, or that decision tool. So you guys can link onto that as well. We had a couple questions on sun hemp. DeAnn, I know you covered that in your slide. What are some of the quick advantages or disadvantages to sun hemp? And I know that you had noticed the producer here commented they have heard it makes a lot of nitrogen.
Yes, it does make a lot of nitrogen. It's a good one for that. The one thing I'll say about sun hemp is that 4 foot tall, because once it gets above 4 foot tall or taller, and you might think 4 foot, that's a little arbitrary. I just say that because once it gets taller, the taller it gets, the thicker the stems get. So the stems can be a little tough to drill back through the next year or plant back through the next year. So if you terminate it when it's younger and it's more vegetative, so it'll decompose better and just make your life easier. But also, you don't want it to ever start to go reproductive, because then the stems get woodier, and also then you're really not having as much nitrogen below ground. So the best time to terminate is also the easiest time to terminate, which is when it's about 4 foot tall. So my counterpart in Oklahoma has noted that they're actually finding sun hemp a little bit hard to terminate, but that's because they've got an even hotter summer. And if people are letting it grow and get really, really big, it's like anything else. The bigger it is, the harder it is to terminate. So 4 foot tall is the max I would let that get before I would terminate that. And then you shouldn't have any problem terminating it.
Okay. And that was the next question. Is it difficult to terminate sun hemp? And you talked about don't let it get over 4 feet tall then.
Yeah, 4 foot tall is a pretty good amount. I also see on here the tenant landowner situation, who should pay for what?
Yeah.
And I would love to flip that back to you, Sandra, because that is usually, I think of that as more an ag econ question. I know you're 10 times the ag economist I am. So what are your thoughts on that? And I think it might be different if it's a grazing situation versus a non-grazing situation, wouldn't it be?
Well, it kind of depends. I don't know if there's a wrong or a right answer, actually. It's kind of how the tenant and the landowner can come up with an agreement, or because I guess you could say, kind of the general rule is any yield increasing input is usually shared by the tenant and the landowner. And that's kind of a general rule. But if it's totally, a cash rent, then the landowner really doesn't have to share in any of that. All he's worried about is getting his cash rent payment. And he really doesn't have any management decisions or anything. But if it's on a crop share basis, then yes, any yield increasing input is usually shared, which could, I guess, be cover crop if you're increasing the nitrogen levels.
Mm-hmm. And over time, if you're building up the soil and improving it, theoretically it could be, but that is a slow increase. That's like watching your 401k. That's kind of a slow increase.
Right.
Rather than a jump,
Right.
I would also play a little bit of devil's advocate on this, because we know when Sandra was talking about yield increasing inputs, we also know that cover crops take moisture in some cases too. And so while we're adding nitrogen, we might also be using the water that we would like to have for a full season crop. And so I think there's a trade-off. And I think that what this really does is it opens up needing to have a very in-depth conversation about what the goals are for this landlord-tenant arrangement.
Yep. That is a good point.
Okay, and we have a couple more questions real quick. We want you guys, if you can, stay on, because we like you to get your evaluations done for these things too. We have a couple more quick questions. When was the winter lagoon terminated in the spring, DeAnn?
Okay, so usually terminated, and that's actually a perfect segue back to what Jeannie was talking about. So the less precip you have, the earlier you should terminate. So like if you're in the very wettest corner of the state, people can terminate that pretty close to planting of the next crop. But the farther west you go, there's also crop insurance implications. So, depending on what part of the state you're in, so there's a map you should consult on that for how far you need to terminate. So I don't have that detail I can tell you this, for Manhattan, it's usually about 4 weeks ahead of time for the wheat sorghum rotation here in Manhattan. For the one at Heston, I think that one was probably also about 4 weeks ahead of time, but I don't have that detail in front of me. But it would be in that research report. I would say there's a lot of people in the eastern part of the state planting soybeans green directly into a cover crop and then terminating the cover crop, and that works great, but that does not work that good for corn. For corn, you're going to want to terminate the cover crop and let it be dead for a little while before you go plant the corn. So that's also going to depend, on what the next crop in the rotation is.
Okay, great, thanks. We did have another question come in about, what about a mix of oats, soybeans, sorghum sudan, turnips, and radishes? Does anyone mix in any leftover soybeans in their cover crop mix? Because you mentioned soybeans as a cover crop.
Yes, that is actually a beautiful sounding mix right there for grazing. So that doesn't have to be for grazing. That'd be a great one for grazing, but if you're just trying to grow biomass, that could be a good one for that too. And yes, using what you have is an even better cover crop, because I've had numerous people say, well, what about a little bit of bin run wheat as a cover crop? Yes, wheat as a cover crop works good too. If you think about covering the ground, wheat as a cover crop is great. If you have it, I would use it. The germination on seeds is just going to sit there and go down over time. So might as well plant it and get some good out of it. But yes.
Okay, now what about, I'm going to play the devil's advocate like Jeannie did.
Yep.
putting winter wheat in if they planted in August? Do you run into planting early and you would run into the wheat curl mite? Would that be a problem?
So the bin run wheat idea works better in a corn soybean rotation.
Okay.
And it doesn't work as good if you have like neighbors with wheat. So yes, you have to manage it well. So bin run wheat for Eastern Kansas works great. For Central Kansas, that's probably not a good idea.
Okay. Okay.
You have to watch your pests. And that's again, back to I know it's a whole big, it depends thing, but it's a one-on-one conversation, which is the other thing I'll say, which is I'm very happy to have a one-on-one conversation with anybody who wants. You can email me or call me. And I know that I've seen at least one name here for somebody on the webinar. I owe an email. I will get back to you. I'm always happy to do that. And you know what? Who's even better? Is your extension agent in your county, because you guys know your county and all those things you just said. Well, we have to think about moisture and we have to think about mites and insects and viruses and things like that. So your local extension agent is also a wonderful resource.
Okay, and we have a couple quick questions. One of them's considering tolerance to low pH soils. Is there any information out there available about pH?
Yes, so on the Midwest Cover Crops Council, once you go in and let's say that you selected cowpeas, there's a link where you click on cowpeas and then it would tell you what they can handle. And also in this very specific question like that, that might be a good thing to also run past your person that you're considering buying seed from. Because let's say they have two kinds of cowpeas. Are they both the exact same? They both handle pH, or maybe one is known to handle low pHs. So that could be a consideration. And your local seed person is also an extremely valuable source of information. And yeah, they're trying to sell seed, but hopefully they want your business for many years, not just one, and hopefully they give you good advice.
Okay. All right. I think the last question that came in is back on the crimson clover. Can that get too evasive? I mean, could that be a problem?
No, it's not that hardy.
Okay.
No,
okay.
It's pretty pitiful. It's gorgeous, but no, it's pretty tender. That one won't get away from you.
Okay.
I did have an email question come in real quick. About inoculating a crop when putting in a cover crop for thinking about fixing nitrogen.
Yes.
What's the value of inoculation? How do you know which ones to use? Everything.
You must inoculate. And so, yes, because those species of bacteria are not just prevalent in the soil. So you have to inoculate. So when you go to order that seed, if you get cowpeas, you'll get cowpea inoculum. If you get sun hemp, you'll get sun hemp inoculum. If you get hairy vetch, you get hairy vetch inoculum. And your seed dealer will be probably saying, do you need inoculum? And then they'll give you, so you have to get the inoculum, and then you have to handle that right. You have to handle, not let it get too hot or too cold or whatever. You have to handle that properly. Thank you for asking that, whoever asked that, because that is a important question. I need to add that to the slides. I've already added a couple things.
Okay.
And next time.
All righty. Okay, well, great. Well, thanks so much for the good questions. And again, thank you, DeAnn, for such an informative presentation this morning. If there's more questions, please put them in the chat there or email your local extension agent and we will get your questions answered for you. Here again is to remind you of our Certified Crop Advisors, or CCA. Here is the QR code that you guys can scan if you're comfortable of scanning that in. Or if you can't get your codes to work, you can just simply just email Jeannie Falk Jones, your name and your CCA number for you this morning. And so we will get that sent in. Some of you have asked when you will be getting credit for those. We're going to wait and send in everything at the end. And we've added a bonus session here to March 14th. So we will be sending in all the CCA credits following that last session. Okay, so here is the evaluation code there, and here is a little either QR code that you can type in there, or you can type in and you can just go to the link there, and hopefully one of our people will put in that link in the chat, and you can just directly go to it. There's only about 5 or 6 questions, but it truly does help us out on what you think about these crop talks if you want to keep us putting these together. So if you really would take the time to complete this evaluation, we truly do appreciate it for us actually. Okay, so thanks again for joining us this morning or at noon. Our next virtual Crop Talk is scheduled for next Monday, which is March 7th from noon to 1. That is Central Standard Time. Our topic is going to be on the climate update, and we're going to talk to you about the Kansas Mesonet Library. So hopefully you guys have used that tool as well for you. Again, we are going to be having one more following this. So we do have a bonus session for you on March 14th. We're going to be talking about the markets, maybe the outlook on some of the markets. So in a couple weeks, as you know, the markets are pretty volatile right now, especially what's going on over in Ukraine and Russia. So maybe in a couple weeks, we'll have a little bit more information for you because I know you are all really, really interested in the markets and that. So please join us in a couple weeks too. So mark that on your calendar for, again, Monday, March 14th. But next Monday, we're going to be meeting for the climate update. So you guys have any questions?
I was just going to have DeAnn give a quick plug on your contact information, DeAnn.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Follow-up questions, because this is obviously a very expansive topic and lots of specific type of things. And so DeAnn, I just thought it would be a good opportunity for you to tell everybody how they can get a hold of you or your website or things along those lines.
Yeah, so I put in my email address. It's just my first name, DeAnn@ksu.edu. And there's my work cell phone number too. You're welcome to call me and ask me questions because they really are one-on-ones. And also, like I said, your agents, because your agents are better at ag econ and probably plant path and entomology and weeds. There's a weed expert right there I'm talking to. So Jeannie is a weeds expert. So, you know, and that's the thing is that they know if they don't know the answer, they know who to ask for an answer or how to find an answer. So, but I am very happy to have a one-on-one combo about cover crops because it's fun. It's my favorite thing.
Well, DeAnn, we really appreciate
soil is my favorite thing.
Soils are your favorite thing. Okay.
And cover crops. The cover crops feed the soil. So yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me though. It's been fun.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us. We know we asked you kind of to tackle a big topic for this today. So thank you for joining us. Thanks all of our audience for joining us today. And with that, we'll conclude our Crop Talk webinar, and we hope to see you guys next week.